My name is Rebecca Hollis. I'm 32 years old, and 3 months ago, my stepmother stood up in front of 200 people at my graduate school commencement and told the woman next to her that her nephew was the more qualified one in the family. I was standing 8 feet away in my cap and gown, holding my master's diploma in structural engineering. She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough for me to hear, loud enough for my father to hear, loud enough for the dean of my program, who happened to be shaking my hand at that exact moment, to hear too. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled, shook the dean's hand a little tighter, and said, "Thank you so much, Dr. Ferris." Then I turned, found my seat, and sat down like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that would end 4 months later, with my stepmother sitting in a boardroom she never should have walked into, watching me sign a contract that would change both our lives, though only one of us knew it yet. This is that story. To understand what happened on that graduation stage, you have to understand Diane. My father, Walter Hollis, married Diane 6 years after my mother passed away. I was 17. Diane came with a son from her first marriage, Colton, who was 20 at the time, and a nephew she talked about more than she talked about me, her sister's boy, Preston, who was studying business at a school 2 hours from our house in Charlotte, North Carolina. From the very first Thanksgiving, I understood the hierarchy. Diane didn't yell. She didn't need to. She had a gentler weapon, comparison, delivered so casually it almost sounded like concern. Preston just made regional manager at 26. Isn't that something, Rebecca? What field did you say you were going into again? She asked me that question at least once a year, every year, for 6 years. She knew exactly what field I was in. She just wanted to watch me say it out loud so she could look faintly unimpressed. My father never corrected her. He'd just say, "Diane doesn't mean anything by it," the same way he'd said it 100 times before. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told a single person outside my own small circle, was that 4 days before that graduation ceremony, I had received a phone call that would make Diane's comment at commencement the last mistake she'd ever get to make without consequence. I just didn't pick up the phone to tell anyone yet. Not then. Charlotte wasn't a big house growing up. 3 bedrooms, a carport instead of a garage, my mother's rose bushes along, the side fence that my father let die within a year of her passing. I don't think he meant to. I think he just couldn't look at them anymore. Diane moved in 18 months after the funeral. By the time she married my father, the roses were gone, and so was any trace that my mother had lived there at all. Diane redecorated the living room within a month. She kept exactly one photo of my mother in the house, a small one, on a shelf in the hallway, angled slightly toward the wall. I was quiet as a teenager. Not sad exactly, just watchful. I noticed things. I noticed that Colton, Diane's son, got a car for his 18th birthday. A used Honda, but a car nonetheless. And I got a savings bond for college, since that's more practical for you. I noticed that when Preston visited on holidays, Diane introduced him to guests before she introduced me, even though I lived there and he didn't. I noticed and I said nothing, because my father had a way of going quiet and small whenever there was tension in the house, and I didn't want to be the reason his shoulders hunched like that. I got into North Carolina State for undergrad, engineering, on a partial scholarship I'd applied for without telling anyone until the acceptance letter came. Diane's reaction was, "Well, that's a very male-dominated field. I hope you know what you're getting into." Then she asked if I'd heard that Preston had just gotten his real estate license. I worked 2 jobs through undergrad. I didn't ask my father for tuition money, partly out of pride, partly because I'd learned that asking Diane's household for anything came with interest I didn't want to pay. I graduated with honors. Diane didn't come to that ceremony. She said she had a prior commitment. It was Preston's birthday dinner. By the time I started my master's program 6 years later, night classes, full-time job at a structural engineering firm, thesis on seismic retrofitting that I was privately proud of, I had stopped expecting anything from that house. I went home for holidays because my father asked me to, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped that someday, something would shift. I didn't know, walking into that graduation ceremony in my rented cap and gown, that the shift was already coming. It just wasn't coming from Diane. It was coming from a woman named Margaret Vance, sitting 3 rows back in the audience, watching me walk across that stage, and taking notes. I didn't know Margaret Vance's name yet. All I knew, sitting in that folding chair after Diane's comment had settled into my chest like a stone. Was that someone in a gray blazer had been watching me a little too closely during the ceremony. I noticed her because she'd clapped for me, really clapped. Stood up halfway out of her seat when they called my name and my thesis title. Nobody else in my row had done that. Diane certainly hadn't. I found out who she was 3 days later on a Tuesday when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Rebecca Hollis? My name is Margaret Vance. I'm a principal at Ashcroft Vance Structural Group. I hope you don't mind. I got your contact information through Dr. Ferris, Ashcroft Vance. I knew the name. Everyone in structural engineering in the Southeast knew the name. They'd done the retrofit on 2 stadiums and the seismic consulting on a hospital expansion that had been written up in 3 trade journals. They didn't hire out of school. They head-hunted from firms that had already spent 5 years training you. I was at your commencement, she said. Dr. Ferris showed me your thesis abstract months ago, and I've been waiting to see how it defended. I have to say, I wasn't expecting to be that impressed by a master's thesis. We don't usually reach out this directly, but I'd like to bring you in for a conversation. Not an interview, a conversation. I sat down on the edge of my bed, phone pressed so hard against my ear, it hurt. I have some questions, she continued, about whether you'd be open to something bigger than an entry position. We've been quietly looking for someone to head a new regional retrofitting division. Your thesis is, frankly, most of the reason your name came up. I told her yes before she'd even finished the sentence. What I didn't tell her, what I could barely admit to myself, was that 4 days earlier, standing on that stage in my cap and gown, I had heard my stepmother tell a stranger that I wasn't the qualified one in the family. And here was a woman who ran one of the most respected engineering firms in 3 states, telling me the opposite, unprompted, based on nothing but the work I had actually done. I didn't say a word about Diane to Margaret. Not that day, not for weeks. This wasn't going to be about revenge. Not yet, it was just a job. But 4 months later, when Margaret Vance asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether I had any family connections to a real estate firm called Whitfield Preston Realty, I would understand, for the first time, exactly how small the world really was, and exactly how much bigger my next move was about to become. The interview with Ashcroft Vance turned into 3 interviews, then a formal offer letter that I read 4 times before I believed it was real. Director of Seismic Retrofit Solutions, a new division built essentially around the ideas in my thesis, a salary that was nearly triple what I made at my old firm, a signing date in early September. I told exactly 2 people before I told my father. My thesis advisor, Dr. Ferris, and my closest friend from grad school, Priya, who screamed so loud on the phone I had to hold it away from my ear. I didn't tell Diane anything. I didn't tell her because I had learned over 16 years that good news handed to Diane came back to me smaller, dimmer, wrapped in some comparison to Preston. So for 2 months I just worked. I gave my notice at my old firm. I signed my new contract. I started building out my division from a borrowed office with a whiteboard and a pot of coffee that never went cold. It was in my 3rd week at Ashcroft Vance that Margaret called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon, sliding a folder across her desk. We've been approached about a due diligence contract, she said. A structural inspection ahead of a commercial acquisition. Big property portfolio, 4 buildings, all mid-rise, all older stock that needs a seismic and structural sign-off before the deal closes. The client's name is Whitfield Preston Realty. I froze with my coffee halfway to my mouth. Preston, I repeated. You know them? I did. Whitfield Preston Realty was Preston's firm, the one Diane had bragged about it. Thanksgiving 4 years running, the one she credited for turning her nephew into, in her words, the only real success story in this family. Preston had made junior partner there 2 years ago. Diane had sent my father a photo of the announcement in the local business journal, framed. My stepmother's nephew works there, I said carefully. I don't have a relationship with the firm. Margaret studied me for a second, the way she had a habit of doing, like she was running numbers behind her eyes. Good, that means no conflict of interest. I want you leading this inspection personally. It's a 2-week engagement. And if the buildings check out, it closes a 9-figure acquisition. 9 figures. My name on the report. deciding whether Preston's biggest deal of his career would close or collapse. I said yes. Of course I said yes. What I didn't yet know, walking out of Margaret's office with the folder under my arm, was that one of those 4 buildings, Building C, a 1970s mid-rise on the edge of downtown, had a structural problem serious enough that somebody at Whitfield Preston Realty had been quietly hoping no engineer would ever look closely enough to find it. I was about to be exactly that engineer. Building C sat on the corner of 5th and Larkin, a squat 1970s mid-rise that had been converted from office space to mixed retail and residential a decade ago. On paper, the renovation records looked clean. Permits filed, inspection signed off, nothing flagged. I don't trust paper. I trust the building. I spent 4 days in that structure with my team, checking load-bearing walls against the original architectural drawings, running numbers on the retrofit that had supposedly been done in 2019. On the 4th day, in the parking structure beneath the building, I found something that didn't match. A support column, one of 6 holding up the northeast corner, had been reinforced according to the paperwork. But the reinforcement in front of me, steel jacketing that should have been continuous, stopped 8 inches short of the footing. Someone had done the visible part of the job and skipped the part nobody would see without opening up the concrete. I ran the calculations twice. Then I had my junior engineer run them independently, without telling her what I'd found. She came back with the same number. In a moderate seismic event, nothing catastrophic, just a 6-point-something on a fault line. The region wasn't even supposed to be that vulnerable to. That corner had roughly a 40% chance of partial failure. There were 11 residential units directly above it. I called Margaret that night. This isn't a due diligence footnote, I told her. This is a life safety issue. Someone signed off on a retrofit that was never actually completed. Who signed the original inspection report? I already knew. I'd seen the signature on the 2019 documents twice that day, and both times my stomach had dropped a little further. Preston Whitfield, I said. He was the project manager of record. There was a long pause on the line. Rebecca, I need you to understand what happens next. If this report goes in as written, it doesn't just kill the acquisition. It exposes negligence with his name directly on it. Possibly criminal negligence, depending on what the city finds when they pull the permits. I need to know right now if that's a problem for you. I thought about every Thanksgiving. Every isn't Preston something. Every year, Diane introduced her nephew to strangers before she introduced her own stepdaughter standing 3 feet away. I thought about 11 families living above a column that had been signed off on by a man who'd apparently decided paperwork mattered more than concrete. It's not a problem, I said. Write it exactly as I found it. I didn't know yet that within a week, Diane would be the one calling me, her voice shaking for the first time in 16 years. Not to apologize, but to beg. The report went in on a Monday. By Wednesday, my phone hadn't stopped. The first call was from my father, sounding smaller than I'd ever heard him. Rebecca, honey, Diane's beside herself. She says there's some kind of report, something about Preston's building. She says you're the one who wrote it. I am, I said. It's accurate, Dad. I checked it 3 times. Can't you? Is there any way to soften it? Preston's whole career. Dad, there are 11 apartments sitting on a column that was never finished. I'm not softening a life safety report to protect someone's job title. He went quiet in that old familiar way, and I felt the same tired ache I'd felt 100 times growing up. Then he said something he'd never said before. You're right. I know you're right. I just don't know how to tell her that. Diane called an hour later. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did, because I don't think I would have believed it otherwise. Rebecca. Her voice was thin, stripped of every ounce of the casual condescension I'd spent 16 years learning to absorb. I need you to understand something. Preston has worked so hard. If this report goes to the city as written, they're saying he could face charges. His whole firm could be finished. Is there anything at all you could adjust? Even just the timeline of when the reinforcement was supposedly completed? I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered. Diane, do you remember my graduation? What you said to your friend about Preston being the more qualified one in the family? A pause. Rebecca, that's not... I heard every word. I've heard some version of it for 16 years. And I want you to know, this isn't about that. I'm not falsifying a structural report to punish your nephew for something you said at my commencement. I'm refusing to falsify it because 11 families live above a column he signed off on without finishing the work. So there's nothing you'll do. There's nothing I should do. There's a difference. She hung up without another word. 3 days later, the city pulled the original permits, cross-referenced them against my report, and opened a formal negligence inquiry into Whitfield Preston Realty's 2019 retrofit sign-off. The acquisition Margaret's client had been counting on collapsed within the week, and 2 weeks after that, I received an invitation in the mail, cream cardstock, gold lettering, to a firm gala where Ashcroft Vance would be publicly announcing the division I now led, the youngest director in company history. I hadn't told my father the date yet. I was about to find out I wouldn't need to. The gala was held at the Dunhill Hotel downtown, the kind of ballroom with chandeliers and a string quartet that made the whole evening feel like it belonged to someone else's life. Ashcroft Vance had rented the entire top floor, 200 guests, clients, city officials, press from the Regional Business Journal, engineers I'd admired since undergrad standing, around with champagne in their hands. I hadn't invited my father. I hadn't invited Diane. I wasn't trying to punish anyone by leaving them off a list. I simply hadn't thought of them as people who belonged in this part of my life anymore. That part of me had learned to build without an audience. Margaret found me near the stage an hour before the announcement, straightening the lapel of my navy blazer like she was sending a daughter off to prom. You built this division from a whiteboard and a coffee pot, she said. Tonight you get to say that out loud. At 8 o'clock, the CEO of Ashcroft Vance took the podium and introduced me as the youngest director in the firm's 41-year history. The engineer whose thesis had, in his words, quietly reshaped how this firm thinks about retrofit safety across 3 states. He mentioned Building C without naming it directly. He mentioned that my division's first act, before it even had a name, had prevented what he called a catastrophic failure of both concrete and conscience. The room applauded. I hadn't expected to see 2 familiar faces near the back, half hidden behind a pillar, until the applause started to fade. My father was standing there in the same brown suit he'd worn to my undergraduate graduation, the one Diane hadn't attended. Beside him stood Diane herself, in a dress that looked hastily chosen, her eyes fixed on the podium with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before. Not condescension, not disappointment, something closer to fear. I hadn't sent them an invitation. Someone else had. Later, after the speeches, after the photographs, after Margaret had steered me through 40 handshakes, I'd barely register in the morning. I found my father waiting by the coat check, alone. Diane's outside, he said quietly. She didn't think she had the right to come in, but she asked me to tell you something first before she left. She said it couldn't wait until tomorrow. I stood there in the marble lobby of the Dunhill, 4 months of silence between me and Diane finally about to break, and I realized I had absolutely no idea whether I wanted to hear what she had to say. I walked outside. Diane was standing near the valet stand, arms wrapped around herself against the October wind, looking smaller than I had ever seen her look in 16 years of Thanksgivings. I saw the seating chart inside, she said before I could speak. Your name on that stage, 200 people standing up for you, and all I could think about was every single year. I made you say your own major out loud, so I could look unimpressed by it. I didn't say anything. I let her keep going. Preston's firm let him go last week, she said, quietly before the story hit the papers. He's facing a deposition. My sister hasn't spoken to me because she thinks I should have. I don't even know what she thinks. I should have done. Made you lie, I suppose. She laughed, short and humorless. I spent 6 years telling you Preston was the qualified one, and you're the reason 11 families didn't fall through a parking structure. I don't know how to sit with that. You don't have to sit with it for my benefit, I said. I didn't do it for you to sit with anything. I did it because it was true, and because it was right. Those 2 things happened to also eventually be inconvenient for Preston. That part isn't mine to feel guilty about. I know. Her voice cracked. I'm not asking you to fix it. I don't think I've earned that. I just needed to say in person that I was wrong about all of it, not just the graduation. I thought about the 17-year-old girl who used to sit at that dinner table doing math in her head just to have somewhere to put her eyes. I thought about the years I'd spent hoping something would shift and how I'd finally stopped hoping and how it had shifted anyway, not because I forced it, but because I'd simply kept being exactly who I was. Thank you for saying that, I told her. I mean that, but I'm not going to pretend the last 16 years didn't happen because you said it once, outside a hotel after your nephew lost his job. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer and had made peace with it before she ever walked outside. For what it's worth, I added, I'm the qualified one. I always was. You just never wanted to be the one who found that out. I didn't wait for a response. I walked back inside, back to the party, back to Margaret and the whiteboard. I'd since replaced with an entire floor of engineers who reported to me, back to the life I had built in complete silence while everyone waited for me to fail. I never needed Diane to see me. I only needed to stop needing her to.